Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Staff Roundtable, hosted by the Division of Market Oversight to discuss position limits. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to the chairman.
Good morning. I just want to welcome everybody. I'll turn it back over to Vince in terms of how the meeting will work. As you know, this is a staff roundtable. This is not a commission meeting. However, it's quite an auspicious occasion in that we now have a commission that is back to full strength with all 5 members. And moreover, all 5 members are in one room, which has not happened for more than a year. So I know we're all delighted to be here. I certainly am as the new chairman. I know my fellow new commissioners, Commissioner Giancarlo and Commissioner Bowen, are very happy. It took us all a little longer to get here than we had all hoped. But now we're back to full strength. We look forward to today's roundtable. We're not going to really make any substantive comments so that we can get right into the questions of the staff, but I look forward to meeting as many of you as I can, and I know my fellow commissioners feel the same way. So back to you, Vince. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and welcome, commissioners. My introduction. I'm Vince McGonagle, Director of the Division of Market Oversight. Thank you all for coming here today. We have a number of substantive panel discussions concerning comments that we've received both to the position limits and the aggregation proposed rulemakings. This is a staff roundtable and is not a meeting being conducted under the Sunshine Act, as the chairman referenced. The commissioners may, of course, ask questions and also request clarifications on points discussed here today. However, when present, commissioners do not plan to engage in the joint conduct or disposition of official agency business and will not deliberate between or among themselves on the topics or issues discussed in today's roundtable. Staff have provided questions to the panelists in anticipation of today's meeting. We've also posted those questions onto the CFTC website. Yesterday evening, we made some revisions to questions for panel 3, so I just draw your attention to the fact that the questions on the website have been changed. The comment period for both the position limits and the aggregation proposed rulemakings have been reopened. The current reopened comment period will continue to July 3. In addition, a video no less, of this roundtable will be posted and available shortly. We welcome comments from the public during the reopened public comment period for both position limits and the aggregation proposal. Comments on the discussion today can be submitted to the Commission during the reopened comment period. Joining me today on my right, Riva Adriance, and on my left, Ken Danger from the Division of Market Oversight. Any views of the staff here represent our own views and do not necessarily represent those of the division or the Commission. I'll note that our job here today is to listen. We're very close now to getting started. We have 4 sessions. I welcome the first panel to the table. Logistically, I'll ask that when you speak, please press the button to talk, briefly introduce yourself and the organization you represent. In addition, please turn off your microphone after you speak, as only a limited number may be on at one time. Please also keep cell phones away from the microphone, and we ask that for comments and questions, if the panelists can place their name card on its end so we'll know to recognize you. I appreciate that. So if we can start just with a brief introduction of the panelists, and I'll start with Ron over here on my left.
Good morning. I'm Ron Oppenheimer. I'm General Counsel of Vitol, Inc., but I'm here on behalf of the Commercial Energy Working Group.
Good morning. I'm John Parsons. I teach corporate finance at MIT Sloan School.
Good morning. I'm Ed Prosser. I am the VP of Agricultural Trading for Gavilon, and I'm here to represent Gavilon and the National Grain and Feed Association.
Good morning. I'm Chris Robertus. I represent CHS Inc., and I'm the Director of Enterprise Risk Management.
Good morning. I'm Michael Ricks with Cargill.
Good morning. I'm Matt Jansen. I'm Chief Risk Officer of ADM. I also serve as the President of our Global Oilseeds business, and I'm also here representing Commodity Markets Council as Vice Chairman.
Good morning, I'm Lael Campbell, Director of Regulatory Affairs for Exelon Constellation, fully integrated energy company. I'm here on behalf of the Edison Electric Institute, which is the association for all of the investor-owned utilities in the United States, and EEI members are responsible for serving electricity to more than 70% of the U.S. population.
Good morning, my name is David Pearlman. I'm from the law firm of Bracewell and Giuliani. We represent the Coalition of Physical Energy Companies, as well as a number of other similarly situated physical companies. Our clients are the hedgers, as well as other people here represent hedgers, but we are hedgers in the physical energy space.
Good morning, I'm Joe Nicosia. I'm a Global Platform Head and Senior Vice President with Louis Dreyfus Commodities.
Good morning, I'm Tim Barry with ICE Futures US.
Good morning, I am Tom LaSala. I am the Chief Regulatory Officer for the CME Group.
Great, thank you. So during this first panel, we're going to focus on hedges for physical commodities, gross hedging, cross-commodity hedging, and anticipatory hedging. We have a number of questions that we had set forth in the document, but before we start sort of digging into those on a one-by-one basis, I'd like to turn it over to Ron to give sort of an overview perspective from the commenters on bona fide hedging. Ron.
Thank you very much, Vince, and thanks to the Commission for holding this roundtable. In particular, I want to thank Chairman Massad and Commissioner Bowen and Commissioner Giancarlo for making time. I know you're probably drinking from the fire hose right now, and so we really appreciate you making time for us. This is a very important rulemaking to us. The Commercial Energy Working Group is comprised of firms from all aspects of the energy business, oil, gas, and power, upstream, midstream, and downstream, integrated companies, and independent companies. And as substantial users of the markets, we support the Commission's mandate that pricing be established by forces of supply and demand and not by extraneous outside forces. We understand, and I think part of the reason why we're still having debates on some of these issues is the Commission's concern for some loopholes that could undermine the ability to limit speculative trading and that would allow speculative trading under the name of hedging. Our concern is on the other side of that, and that is that legitimate hedging activities might be sacrificed in order to prevent any abuse that might occur in the marketplace. We think it's very important to keep focused on the public policy drivers behind speculative position limit rules. The speculative position limit rules have always existed for one particular purpose, and that's to prevent the harm that could be caused by excessive speculation. And Dodd-Frank really didn't change that. Dodd-Frank had speculative position limit provisions in it mainly to accomplish two goals. First of all, to include swaps within the speculative position limit regime, and secondly, to address concerns that had arisen with respect to what I'll call investor money, principally on the long side, and what effect that might have on pricing. The Dodd-Frank provisions really weren't addressed at perceived abuses with respect to commercial hedging. In fact, really the opposite. In Dodd-Frank, Congress gave the Commission exemptive authority so that any legitimate end-user hedging activity that wasn't foreseen at the time could be exempted by the Commission as it saw fit. And the public interest also supports commercial hedging because, at the end of the day, effective hedging programs reduce the ultimate price of energy commodities and all commodities to consumers. We're very committed to working with the Commission to address all of these issues. We have for the last, unfortunately, several years, I will say. We're interested in closing the loopholes. We're interested in preserving the markets for legitimate commercial end-user hedging. And personally, I'd like to say we're committed to trying to put this behind us and focus on other things. The working group's written extensive comments, and I know that you've got them. You've probably read them. If not, I know that you will read them in the near future. And I'm not going to address everything in the comment letter, but as Vince said, I'd like to sort of lay out some of the landscape of the different issues that we see out there. And it may seem like a long list, but it's really not. I think we're in striking distance with some good constructive dialogue to closing the gaps on some of these issues. Two of them are new in the proposed rule that didn't exist in some of the other speculative position limit rules that we've seen in the past. The first one is the construct of what's called the economically appropriate test. It's always been the case that the statute and the regs said that a hedge had to be economically appropriate to the reduction of risks in the conduct and management of a commercial enterprise in order to be bona fide. But in the proposal, for the first time, the Commission's written that the measurement of that is that it has to reduce the risk to the entire enterprise. In other words, that risk has to be managed on a global affiliated entity basis. And that's not how risk is managed in the energy space. Different companies do it differently. Some do it on the enterprise basis. Some do it on a corporate or division-wide basis. Some do it by trading desk or trader, and some do it on a strategy level. And many do it on a combination of all of those things. The rule wouldn't permit that. We think that's a problem, and we think that that needs to be addressed so that companies can manage their risk in the prudent ways they see appropriate to do it. In the cross-commodity hedging space, there's a new quantitative test that never existed before. Essentially, there's a safe harbor for cross-commodity correlations that exceed a particular mathematical number. That formula, and we've put some examples in our comment letter, would exclude from bona fide hedge treatment things that we commonly use as cross-hedging, the most obvious being natural gas to hedge power prices. But in the oil space, blend stocks, which become gasoline or become RBOB, which is the deliverable grade under the NYMEX contract, some of the blend stocks also would not qualify for cross-commodity treatment, and we think that's a problem. Some of the older issues that have been out there but remain a problem are the so-called 5-day rule. So-called 5-day rule by itself, in its simplest form, is not that big a problem. It suggests that you can't hold a commodity for certain types of hedges into the last few days of trading in the contract if you don't have the ability to make or take delivery of that commodity. It works in some cases. In others, it doesn't. When the Commission first passed that rule in 1977, the only commodities it had speculative position limits for were agricultural commodities, and it specifically said at some time in the future when we consider other commodities, we will consider changing the 5-day rule. That's particularly appropriate at this point in time. Very simply, deliverable supply is the baseline for which the Commission will establish spot month position limits. The CME has submitted updated data for what constitutes deliverable supply and energy contracts. We would recommend that the Commission adopt those numbers of deliverable supply for the purpose of setting spot month limits. The single and all month limits for the RBOB and the heating oil futures contracts quite simply are too low. The Commission's data, it's in Table 11 of the proposed rule, supports the fact that they're too low. It identifies between 7 and 11 companies whose positions would have exceeded the limits if they were in place as they're proposed to be set. And taking those companies out of the market would draw substantial liquidity away from the markets, particularly in the out months where liquidity is limited to begin with. Trade options and volumetric options are really physical delivery contracts and not hedging instruments or speculative instruments, and should be removed from the speculative position limit rules. And we would support a process whereby the Commission could look at non-enumerated hedges on an expedited basis. The biggest issue to us is, of course, merchandising and anticipatory merchandising hedging. The working group has put a number of examples in its comment letters. Many of them were the subject of a petition filed with respect to the now vacated rule. I'm not going to go into detail of any of them right now, but would be delighted to, either as part of this discussion or later, to explain exactly why they are risk reducing and not speculative positions. It's a little surprising that the subject has become as controversial as it has. The starting point for considering whether or not merchandising hedges and anticipatory merchandising hedges should be permitted is really the statute. And it's very clear that the statute provides for those types of hedging activity. There's no distinction in the statute between that kind of activity and anticipatory hedging by producers and processors. And there's no, we think the problem may stem from a fundamental misunderstanding of the merchandising function. Merchandisers move commodities from one location to another where prices dictate they should go, where supply is in lesser supply in one region and greater demand in the region, prices dictate that it should move. And the merchandisers connect the producer to the consumer. Merchandisers actually own the commodity. They store the commodity, they blend the commodity, and they deliver them to users so that the users can demand them on an as-needed basis, freeing up their own credit and their capital for other uses. Merchandisers buy commodities in regions where users can't or decide not to go and have commercial relationships. Merchandisers allow producers and users to outsource all the logistics and risks of arranging transportation and scheduling, managing customs, inspections, and all the other operations that go along with a physical energy business. Merchandisers have as much invested in their business as producers and processors. It's their credit and capital that support the purchases, sales, and the inventory they carry. They own and they charter vessels and barges. They own or lease storage and pipeline capacity and transmission, and they invest in technology, systems, and personnel that make it all work. In short, merchandising should never be confused with paper trading. We don't see the logic in permitting anticipatory hedging for producers and processors while prohibiting it for merchandisers. Just as a very quick example, a merchandiser who buys a product at a floating price with the intention of moving it somewhere else and selling it at a floating price needs to lock in the differential between those two prices in order to justify making the purchase in the first place and engaging in the merchandising activity that brings the commodity to the consumer where the consumer needs it. It's really no different than the producer who has oil in the ground that he has not yet produced and has not yet sold. He has an unfixed price risk, which he wants to hedge with an anticipatory unsold production hedge. It's the same thing as the processor who hasn't yet filled his requirements. If the merchant has sold before he has bought, he has the same risk that the processor has when he's trying to hedge his unfilled anticipated requirements. Just in closing, I want to say that the concern about speculation slipping through a door open for hedging has some serious criteria that will limit those possibilities that are already in place. And I know you know of all of them, so I'll go very quickly, but some of them go to the staff's questions. The ordinary course documents maintained by a physical energy company will go a long way toward defeating any possibility that the hedging exemption is abused. A company's hedging strategy is in its documents, and whether it's conducted at an affiliate-wide basis or something else, that's also contained in their records. Whether they've made a binding bid or offer and how they've hedged it, that's in their records. What financial commitments they've made to an anticipated transaction, such as establishing one leg of a two-legged transaction, that's in their records. And all of the transaction records that support a bona fide hedge exemption are required to be kept under CFTC rules and made available for inspection and responsive to special calls. DCM oversight will remain in place. In my opinion, it's the most effective tool to ensure against abuse, and I think Tom will probably cover that more as we go forward. Positions that are in excess of spec limits pursuant to a hedge exemption have to be reported on a Form 204 and explained, and that's done under the penalty of perjury. And so I think that goes a long way to ensuring that there won't be false statements about hedging activity. And then finally, there's anti-disruptive trading practice requirements, there are orderly trading requirements, and there are anti-manipulation rules. So if anybody took a position in claiming a hedge exemption and did anything that disrupted the markets, there's ample opportunity to challenge that activity. In closing, I just want to say thank you again. We are very grateful for all the time that the Commission and the staff has given us over the years as we've debated position limits. We're very hopeful that we can continue to do that, and we're hopeful we can be a resource to the Commission as we move forward. Thanks, Vince, and I'm happy to move to questions.
Thanks, Ron. I think that's a very good overview of the session for this morning. I want to go into some detail with respect to the application of these particular hedges, thinking about some of the themes that we articulated in the questions, which are, focusing first on what the statute discusses on the economic appropriate test, which is the reduction of risk in the conduct and management of a commercial enterprise. How are these risks then separately being managed, separate from a request for a bona fide hedge exemption? How does the firm manage its own risk profile, and how is the request for the exemption consistent with that profile? What assistance can you give us, the staff, on evaluating the difference between what is being put forth as a bona fide hedge exemption request versus speculation, and then how do we document that? And I know Ron's touched on a number of these in particular examples. Looking at gross hedging then, for example, I know in the notice of proposed rulemaking, we were focused on, if you drill down to identified specific risks, we put forth that the staff would be in agreement that so long as you didn't need to require that there be netting, but that if you had multiple identified specific risk, if you hedged each of those, that might be sufficient for an exemption. The question I think that we see is there selective use of a specific identified risk for a hedge exemption that effectively doesn't result in the netting of risk at the entity level? And so how do we differentiate with respect to gross hedging a bona fide exemption versus speculation? And I think the same analysis might apply to the difference of the operating units. So I put that out to the panel if you want to talk in a little bit more detail about how we can evaluate gross hedging in a way that would recognize a bona fide hedge exemption.
I'm going to answer that question, but I want to make a statement first. This is Dave Pearlman, that I agree with really everything Ron said, but I would ask that the Commission think about, in the context of this issue, potentially taking a step back, because I don't want the conversation to start out with the concept that the only way to deal with issues of position limits and dealing with the concern about excessive speculation is to create a regime of enumerated hedges and complex record keeping and difficult reporting arrangements. Because the thing I want to say, I agree again with what Ron said, but stepping back from that, my clients are a group of physical energy companies that are historically users of the exchanges, and they're familiar with the manner in which exchange position limits work, and they have over-the-counter swaps historically. And in doing so, they manage their risk, and I'll get to your question in a minute. But in doing so, they understand what they need to do if they need a hedge exemption, which is to come to the exchange, because they're not in the enumerated hedge world, and basically explain what their risks are, show their physical business, and then through the exchange's well-equipped staff who are expert in this, there's a manner in which a hedge exemption can be provided to an entity that needs one, and I'm sure that Tom can talk about that in more detail. But for my clients, we're switching from that regime, which is one in which they can talk about their business, talk about what their risks are, provide sufficient information to get a hedge exemption which caps their position, to one in which every time they do a trade, they have to figure out which enumerated hedge it is. The trader has to know that. It needs to be identified, needs to go into the records. If they're dealing with a swap dealer, they're going to need to make binding reps that this can be a pass-through hedge, and do a number of very complicated and actually confusing activities to completely change the regime they're living within. The other thing they're going to have to do is track swaps in this regard. And again, the one thing we'd like you to think about is that swaps that are OTC swaps, and as Ron said, trade options, these are not price discovery vehicles. We understand the need in a price discovery world to be concerned about excessive speculation, but we'd ask you to think about whether there's a price discovery impact of excessive speculation in non-transparent OTC swaps, and certainly in physical delivery trade options. So we would like you, for our segment of the market, which is hedgers, who have historically been on exchanges and been able to have non-enumerated relationships where we would get hedge exemptions, as well as engage in over-the-counter swaps, to maybe think about ways to make this less burdensome, because this is the most burdensome element of Dodd-Frank to non-registrants. And to turn around and implement this at organizations that are not well-resourced to make this an entire effort. When we were about to do it last time, it was incredibly burdensome. So with that, I'll answer your question. I'll be happy to talk more about this threshold issue.
Well, do we want to see, is there any reaction on the panel, agreement or comment on those remarks?
I guess we're the Lone Ranger on this. But I do think, frankly, if you were to reach out to market participants who are not at a sophisticated level of doing significant amounts of merchandising, trading, that sort of thing, that were more, I would call them garden variety hedgers, you'll find that what I'm telling you is very much a concern that they have. And again, you have, I think, a little more of a higher level of sophistication around this table than, frankly, if you to think about the numbers that this rule affects of just individual organizations, probably the bulk of those organizations are in the category that I'm describing, and we can talk about it offline, or we can bring those people to meet with you if you like, than the folks who do larger and more sophisticated business. So let me come back to your question, and I think it follows along what Ron was saying. When companies such as the companies that I represent do their hedging and think about how they're hedging their risk, they start out with a structure where typically, from a management perspective, they have no interest in, and frankly, they're prohibited from speculating. So the organization has a structure in which speculation is not permissible. That is typically the case. There may be some very minor speculative activity that could be permitted to engage in price discovery or some sort of non-business line activity. It's really not the purpose of it. But the purpose of touching these markets is to hedge. So you start out by looking at the basic mission that the individuals touching these markets have, which is to hedge. There's also oftentimes, if you have loan documents or project finance arrangements around these types of businesses, the lenders will have require covenants that there will be no hedging. I mean, no speculation, and there will be likely a mandate for some level of hedging. And that's what we see in our business. So we have documentation that at the threshold, before you go into the market, you are precluded from speculating, or if there's some kind of tiny tranche you can, or your lender precludes you from speculating, requires you to hedge. And as Ron said, then what follows from that is an effort to execute the mandate that's been provided by management. And in doing so, this whole idea of gross or net or whatever across the enterprise is really not contemplated in the kind of quantitative techniques that you're talking about, or how to actually capture this for you to then come back with what I assume you're talking about as an enumerated hedge of some sort. It's really a business-related process that is endeavoring to accomplish the hedging mission of the business. And you'll see an entire sort of dialogue between management and the business to identify how they're hedging, to accomplish hedging, to report that they've implemented a hedge plan, to have periodic reports on how the hedges are performing, all that sort of thing. And I think if you were to look to understand gross, net, whatever, because that's not the way that it's thought of, whether there was hedging taking place, you would find a significant, documentary basis for it. And frankly, I think people would have personnel action taken against them if they went to speculate in this business segment, because frankly, that's a great way to lose money. And these people are not in the business, and their investors don't want them speculating. So, the bottom line of what I'm saying is that the way you're looking at it is not the way these businesses look at it. If there's something you'd like them to do to demonstrate that they're hedging in some technique that would be satisfactory to you to demonstrate that, that could be done. But it's a backfit on everything that's done today. And frankly, The whole enumerated hedging process is a backfit on what people do today. It is not the way that firms think about their activities when they hedge.
Thanks, David. Joe?
Thank you. In response to your question, I'm going to go a little bit around it, but get to it. When we look at gross or net hedging, the ability to take it in totality in a global basis or in an entire universe is almost impossible. I think it's important for the Commission to understand and recognize that we have many risks that we manage and hedge within our own businesses. And these risks are more than just flat price or absolute price risk. These risks that we have, if you take a narrow and a restrictive view of the interpretation of hedging, can be very detrimental to our business. Some of these risks will include time risk, we have location risk, quality risk, quantity risk, credit risk, execution risk, counterparty risk, governmental or sovereign risk, just to name a few of these things. And we need the marketplaces in order to hedge these in very different ways. Probably the most important thing is that you need to recognize that price risk is not just absolute, but is also relative price risk. It seems that that has been lost somewhere along the way. When we say relative price risk, we're talking about the ability to have ownership and then have an offsetting, what is known as a hedge, against it. The most common form of this is to use futures and what is known as basis trading. But basis trading in and of itself is a risk. It is a shift of risk from absolute to relative. It is one that requires usually the use of the futures market, and it also requires us to be able to use futures, future spreads, and the cash market. Along this line, in taking care of this risk, one of the most important things is convergence, the need for convergence in the marketplace. And convergence takes place not just by a user or a producer, but more importantly also with the inclusion of the merchandiser. It is their inclusion in these markets that allows and calls for the convergence within the futures market. In order to have that, the hedger, the merchandiser, has to be able to be allowed to use the marketplace and have access to it. Without it, risk premiums are going to rise throughout our business. And when the risk premium rises, it's going to move throughout the supply chain, and that'll raise the cost of doing business. And the end result of that is that the producers will receive less for their product. Consumers are going to pay more for their product because someone has to absorb that risk cost that's going to take place. Bid-offer spreads are going to widen, liquidity is going to dry up, and ultimately less business is going to be done here. So when we look at that, there's really three main issues that we need to really address here. One is the inclusion of merchandising into the exemption. It is not understandable how that could be removed. The merchant accepts far more risk than anyone else in the value chain. He has to absorb all of those risks that I mentioned before. The second area is anticipatory. The anticipatory hedging needs, there is almost nothing that takes place in this business that doesn't have some form of anticipation in it. Whether you will make a sale, whether your quality will be right, whether the quantity will arrive on time, what time the boat arrives, whether your export commitments, whatever the case may be, not to mention simple things such as weather. And the third thing is your treatment of fixed and unfixed sales, with your inability to recognize unfixed sales as that of which a need that the merchandiser has for treatment in the hedging. Now, to return to the question about a universal versus a gross versus net. Because we have so many different needs to be hedged, not just absolute flat price risk, you will find that different entities, whether they be assets, whether they be countries, whether they be products, whether they be cross products, have different means and times for those risks that they need to hedge. The fact that you may be long soybeans universally does you no good if you have a crushing plant in an area that has had a drought or a short in supply. You will not be able to move those beans from South America on a timely basis into your plant in Indiana. And conversely, same thing that can take place of whether you are working on shipping lines, transportation, logistics, whether it is. So no matter what you do, even if you try to look at it on a global basis, you will have to manage your risk on an entity, but more importantly, on a need basis, because those needs will arrive from both geographical different needs, from the ability to have to deal with supply, from the ability to have to deal with execution. and therefore it is universally impossible to do it on a total universal basis.
Thanks, Joe. Lael?
Yeah, I want to comment on this gross versus net issue because it's very important to the electricity industry, which is very regional in nature. Electricity prices can vary depending on the unique attributes of different parts of the country. Supply, load, fuel type requirements can all make electricity prices very different depending on the region you're in. Most risk in the electricity industry is not managed on an entity level, certainly not managed on an enterprise level. It's managed on a regional level. We have traders that are responsible for a portfolio of positions, either customer demand, which we call load in the electricity industry, or generation. And they're responsible for managing the risk in their particular region. We could be have much less generation than we do customers to serve in Texas, where prices are trading around $150, and we could have much more generation in the Northeast than we do have customers served. So we're long generation Northeast, where the cost is around $60. Those positions are not natural offsets to each other. They need to be managed independently, and forcing us to net these types of positions is going to cause problems. Even within the same region, I could have a gas generator, steel in the ground. I'm managing the risk of that generator. I have fuel requirements that I have to manage. I may also have gas storage facility in that same region, but I may need to manage that gas storage facility separately from that generator, even if it's in the same region, because I don't necessarily have the transmission to get the gas out of the storage to that particular generator. So it's just very important that, and I want to echo what David said, what Ron said at the outset, and what Joe just said. Accepted risk management practices of the industry that have been around for a long time need to be maintained. There's a lot of distrust in the rules, and as Ron pointed out in the outset, there's no evidence of anyone abusing the bona fide hedge rules to engage in speculative activities. And in an attempt to catch a theoretical bad actor, you are potentially impacting real, legitimate hedgers that have serious risks to manage in their day-to-day business operations. And one other point I want to make is that, Joe talked about this too, and so did David, is that there are built-in controls within each of our companies. These are important risks for us to manage. We have an army of people that are every day assessing our physical risk exposures and our hedges against those exposures. If a hedge gets out of whack, gets out of correlation, that's costing us money. And we're going to have to do something about it to adjust the hedge or put on a hedge if something's not hedged enough. We have the infrastructure in place. We are managing value at risk VAR every single day and adjusting our hedges accordingly. So again, I think the commission should be very deferential to those that are out in the industry every day managing these risks. They have a lot of experience doing it. They have a lot of infrastructure in place to make sure they're doing it right. And I would hope that at the end of the day, we can have a rule that's deferential to those practices.
Thanks, Lael. We'll go to Matt and then Tom, and then I want to move to cross-commodity hedging.
Okay, thank you. And first of all, I agree with everything that's been said from the panel so far this morning. When I think about ADM, for an example, as a hedger and a merchandiser of crops, we have over 400 locations just in the U.S., and many of those are locations that are deliverable in one form or another. And so we are, as an example, a place where convergence actually happens. And I think one of the potential consequences that we're facing right now is, as Joe pointed out, is a potential lack or a moving away from convergence that I don't think is anything that this committee or the industry supports. And so as we're buying and merchandising the U.S. crops in these 400 locations and even more, this ability to we manage on an as-need basis the risk at the location, and then we also aggregate that up to from an enterprise standpoint. So there is a component of netting, but it's on an as-need basis, and I believe it's extremely important to be able to maintain that flexibility. in order to allow us to do that.
Tom, before we go to you, Ken had a comment.
I just wanted to tee up a really simple example. Sometimes it's helpful. I know it's very complicated, the situations that you're all facing, but it's sometimes good to focus on something simple. So let's tee up this example, this hypothetical. Let's imagine that we have an all months combined.
Can move the mic up a little bit.
I'm sorry. We have an all months combined limit the commission has established. Let's imagine that number is 20 contracts. And let's imagine then a trader has sold forward 3 months from now at a fixed price 50 contracts worth of this commodity, purchase forward 50 contracts of this commodity at a fixed price, and then in 6 months' time has sold another 50 contracts at a fixed price. So in that 5 to 6 months, and it's all at the same location. So those 50 contracts presumably could be used to satisfy the sales that are 6 months out. And so what I'd like you to have a think about and maybe talk about is, would it be appropriate for that trader to hedge all of its fixed price sales contracts in the nearby contracts? In other words, put on 50 contracts worth of long fixed price futures and to hedge its fixed price sales 6 months out when the spec limit is indeed 20 contracts. Would that be bona fide hedging or not? Would that be increasing risk to the firm? So just that's all this trader has on. It's just those simple fixed price sales and purchases.
So I think you got Ed to bite.
When you think about the way that in the enumerated ag space, we hedge our book, we look every day for the most effective hedge that we can find. That hedge might not be right next to every sale that we have on, but as you look at each one of those individual sales, they aggregate into a larger risk, and you then try to find what is the most effective hedge with location and quantity and quality and all those other risks other than price that we talked about. So I think the idea that we segregate each one of our individual transactions and try to hedge that individual transaction, in Matt's case, would be tens of thousands of transactions a month, and it's impractical. I think that one of the things that the Commission doesn't understand quite well enough is the complexity of this gross hedging concept. A bushel of wheat in Australia and a bushel of wheat in Indiana and a bushel of wheat in Washington, if you throw it all together and then hedge it one time, if you got purchases and sales, it seems simple. But the fact is that those cash commodities have unique risks all their own, and they're not equivalent. So forcing us to try to create some equivalency of cash before we go to the derivative is really the crux of the problem here when we try to figure out what we're doing on this gross versus net. The reason that we don't all hedge gross is because it doesn't work. It's not an effective hedge. We have to go out and segment. Ukrainian wheat hedged in Chicago has an entirely different risk profile than wheat in the Ohio Valley hedged in Chicago. And I think that gets to the point where these businesses are very complex. It's much too simple just to make these physical commodities equivalent to the derivative and say that everything's left you can hedge, but you have to offset first.
But if I might go back to you, in the very specific hypothetical that I asked about, is that increasing risk to the firm or decreasing risk?
Ken, if I could try that. First of all, in the specific question that you asked, almost never exists, okay? Because you have quality risk, you have time risk, you have execution risk. But even as you start to narrow it down to the 1/100th of a percent of what we actually do that falls into that category, you can have legitimate reasons for that. For example, it very well may involve an asset, because that transaction may take place all within your own elevator, for example, if it were grain. And during that 6-month time period that you have, if you are going to be locking up grain, maybe you've bought that exact stuff and you're going to carry it forward. Maybe you have already even bought it forward and not carrying it. But if you carry it forward, you have storage income that you want to protect at that point in time. And when you say protect it, because as the market moves, the value of what you have changes. So if the board spreads change over time, the fact that you do or do not have it hedged does not mean that the value of what you have in store does or does not change, because it does. And for example, if the market were to invert and you were long in store, even though it's against a sale for 6 months out, it would be to your benefit to sell that grain out immediately and replace it with another purchase down the road. Conversely, if you went to a very large carry in the marketplace, it would behoove you to maybe buy additional grain today because you would build on your storage, make more money by carrying it to your 6-month sale and actually selling out what you had originally pegged against that sale for him. So these dynamics that take place in the marketplace is how we manage inventory, how we manage risk, and create the opportunity that the markets create, because carries and inverses are creating the ability to alter the flow of the commodity that's there. That's our job to react to it. So yes, it can definitely be an appropriate hedge and thing of how we manage our inventory.
Tom, you were up for a couple of minutes ago. I don't know if we passed you by.
No worries. Thanks, Vince. Just a quick comment observation, I guess on process, because there were a number of comments around the table, what people are used to, exchange managed exemptions. I just want to take a moment and just clarify that. I mean, clearly at CME Group, we're in the business of managing exemptions in enumerated markets as well as those that are non-enumerated. And frankly, there are differences between the two. In the enumerated, you're bound to enumerated examples as detailed in the regulations. In the non-enumerated, there's broader authority. For example, risk management exemptions, which in today's world, where I know some of the comments made around the table, would be reflective of things such as anticipatory merchandising. So I guess one of the challenges, I think there's two major challenges here today, and these examples I think are great. The challenges are, you've got a circumstance that, one of the circumstances we deal with is in one, I want to say asset class, something seems very legitimate. Examples of anticipatory merchandising that we feel comfortable and grant exemptions. They seem logical, economically appropriate. You can demonstrate past performance by the participant in terms of sales, movements. We can grant that. Always sensitive to concentration and the like. In the enumerateds, it's not available. The challenge, I would say, is furthered here in this exercise. That's a challenge for this agency. Is in the proposal, not only do you have this disparity, but now you're in some regards taking away. So we have the hard explanation to a company or companies saying, on one hand, this makes total sense, we'll do this here. It's the exact same thing in another asset class, and for some reason it's non-applicable. And then in the proposal, we seemingly do away with some of those.
I'd like to just ask a question to follow up, Tom. When you said it's not available in the enumerated, it sounds as if, I'm trying to understand if I'm understanding correctly, because enumerated is available, if it's an enumerated exemption, it is available. I think what you're saying is that if there's this particular trade that the trader wants to hedge is not enumerated, you're referring to the fact that what is the process for going through and getting a non-enumerated hedge exempted to allow it to be used as a bona fide hedge? Is that what you're referring to?
No, I'm sorry, maybe it wasn't clear. While you could get a non-enumerated exemption by petitioning the commission in markets such as energy, though the ability for us to grant those types of exemptions are within our discretion as the contract market. And entities around the table here will tell you that, well, we've applied for and I think appropriately received those exemptions in the energy space, yet that exemption, broadly speaking, is not simply available because it's not enumerated in, let's say, the agricultural markets.
So just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, so what you're bringing up is the issue that under their proposal, whether or not you as an exchange would be able to grant a particular exemption if somebody comes to you. You're talking about the limitation that might place on you, on your ability to grant an exemption.
It certainly places a limitation on me. It does. I think it places, I guess, additional challenges on the party requesting that exemption.
John?
So I'm going to try to address Ken's question, and I think, the specific question you asked about that particular hedge, there's a classic case that addresses that, which is the oil hedge speculation that Metallgesellschaft did back in 1993. There's been a whole raft of literature trying to analyze exactly your question, most of which arrived at that hedging with the front month for that particular one was a speculative venture and increased the risk of the firm. I think it's a useful case to look back at to address some of the other points that have been made here. I think it identifies very clearly that quite often you have companies that look like end users that are speculating. And in particular, back then in 93, when there was much less liquidity in the oil market, they consumed a huge volume of the front month contracts. They moved the price when they rolled that particular strategy. And they had to trade OTC contracts to try to hide the size of their position. And those OTC contracts were relevant for moving the prices. So I think there's a bigger point here. We have lots of research that demonstrates that there is speculation done by end users, obviously not by all end users, and obviously there's a lot of hedging. I can think of a particular article demonstrating that in the chemicals industry, there's a lot of speculating on interest rates. More recent literature about lots of commodity companies' derivatives position fluctuating far too much to be counted as hedges for those companies' positions. And when we talk about this gross hedging point, many people have pointed out, I think accurately, that oftentimes companies don't structure their hedges that way because there's geographical basis risk. But you can see my point about speculation in the same way. There are lots of electricity companies that trade derivatives in regions of the country where they have no physical positions whatsoever. They're running a proprietary trading book in that particular transaction. So I think it's true that it's very hard to impose this kind of a gross hedging criteria because for a lot of real hedges, that's not how it's managed. But I think you have the real problem of how to distinguish some actual speculation that really does go on from real hedging. And I think there are only two ways to do that. One is measurement, quantification, which companies regularly do because they want to measure and show that they're reducing hedge. There's no other way for senior management to maintain serious control over operations without some kind of quantification. But there's also lots of other business practices that's been discussed here. I think we're repeating a conversation that we had over the Volcker rule, which successfully focused on what are the actual documentation, business practices, compensation practices, and so on. We can't look at any transaction independently of how it's actually operated in the company. And it seems to me we arrived in that at a very successful resolution. Everything remains to be seen, but it was realistic because it looked at what companies actually did and tried to distinguish them. And you can distinguish proprietary speculative trading from hedges, and it happens inside the way companies manage them.
But John, other than measuring or quantifying the risk, as you put it, it sounded like you had something else in mind in addition to that that could be used as a tool.
Well, business practices do it. Most companies that do speculative trading in the way you see those speculative books managed are going to be managed differently than the hedge. And most of the time, hedges are going to be managed in concert with the physical positions that they're attempting to hedge. And there will be a number of forensic or fingerprint evidence that that's how the company is managing its operations. For example, if you're hedging, you're going to be rewarding your traders for reducing risk. Whereas if you're doing speculative trading, they're going to be given bonuses for the size of the profit, which is going to be more when it's a larger profit. If you're giving them incentives to reduce risk, you're not going to want to see a huge outsized profit on a particular transaction. So that's an example of the business conduct that can distinguish one from the other.
Great. We'll turn quickly to cross-commodity hedging, and then I want to move back over to anticipatory merchandising. On cross-commodity hedging, Ron touched on two items in the overview that he gave, but we have a qualitative test, a quantitative test, and there's a recommendation or consideration surrounding whether there's exit from trading of that particular commodity within the final days of trading. So I put out to the panel, there's a general question of those three items, sort of where should staff be focusing our time on the comments? Where are your biggest concerns?
Yeah, I'm Mike Ricks. I guess when it comes to cross-hedging, I mean, I don't know if you could look at almost any commodity and you're going to find periods where it's 100% positive correlation and 100% negative correlation, just given the time of the year, the events, the environments. You know, to assign an 80% correlation in order for it to be a valid cross-hedge is beyond impossible, simply because these relationships are so dynamic. So what a merchant's going to do is, you could argue that buying a truckload of corn in the middle of Kansas, which is not deliverable, and hedging it in Chicago, that could be cross-hedging because it's not deliverable. Or buying, a vessel of corn in the Ukraine, should that be hedged or not? The merchant is going to make the decision, basically, how is that transaction going to reduce the risk? And it may well be that not hedging is the way to do it. It may well be that hedging that truckload of corn in Kansas, that may be best hedged in the wheat pit, because that corn is going to likely compete with wheat for feed, or it may be best hedged in Chicago. So how you define cross-hedging, and these relationships, like I said, can go from, negative 1.0 to positive 1.0, and the merchant's going to look in his time period which one is going to reduce the risk.
So are you focusing us more on evaluation, on a qualitative analysis, and moving away from a quantitative review?
Yeah, because I believe that's what was mentioned in the rules, an 80% correlation or along those lines. And we're going to look at, in the window that we're exposed to that risk, which derivative or not derivative is the best way to reduce that risk. But what that does too is, it's not just the actions of Cargill or one firm or ADM. It's the wisdom of all the firms making these decisions. That gets immediately transmitted into prices. These price signals are transparent. The whole market sees them. And that's how people make decisions. That's how we allocate scarce resources. That tells a farmer what to grow. That tells a feeder, should I take corn out of my ration, increase soybean meal? That tells a flour miller, should I use more spring wheat, less soft wheat? That's why there's so much interest in this, because we see these signals get efficiently transmitted every day into the role that they provide in allocating scarce resources. And our fear is that with this rulemaking, we break that mechanism.
So I'll turn it to Ron, but this is sort of the objective identifying of factors to look at, what we have is sort of art and science. The qualitative factor is a quantitative factor. So, if we're charged with evaluating why people have sought the particular hedge for cross commodity, how are we able to do that across industry or across platforms, Ron?
Yeah, thanks. So I just want to point out a couple of things maybe for the new commissioners that may not be obvious. Cross commodity is essentially defined as any commodity that's not deliverable under the exchange contract. And what that means in the oil space is that, for example, sour crude is not deliverable on the NYMEX contract, so that's a cross-commodity hedge. The energy industry has got a wide variety of products that come out of the ground, sweet, sour, different sulfur specs and the like, resulting in many, many cross-commodity relationships there. There are a variety of grades of gasoline. Gasoline itself is not deliverable under the RBOB contract, and then there are many, many different grades of gasoline. But on top of that, you then have components that go into gasoline, and those are all considered cross-commodity. So this is a vast swath of the hedging that's done in the energy space, and that's why it takes on, pretty significant importance. Some of the commodities that I just mentioned would not pass the 80% test, and therefore, the presumption was that they would be that they couldn't be used. Blend stocks that one might hold in tanks in New York Harbor that will become RBOB would not be usable to, you couldn't use the RBOB contract. But then you shift into the 5-day rule, and that says you have to get out in the last 5 days, even if you would be using those blend stocks to deliver on the actual NYMEX contract that you were trying to hedge with. And that's one reason why the 5-day rule doesn't really work.
But are you proposing sort of an exception to an exception? Not every situation is as you present, right? So if someone is using a cross-commodity hedge, in the normal circumstance, do they need to be standing for delivery?
No, as I said at the beginning, there are circumstances where we recognize the 5-day rule makes some sense. That's one where it wouldn't. I'm sorry, if I just, 2 other points. There are also deliveries that we make. So we might have inventory in tank where we're making a delivery that crosses over that 5-day period, and it's completely inappropriate to roll out of that hedge or not hedge if you're taking the commodity in with that contract during that period. So that doesn't make sense. The last point I want to make about the 5-day rule is that, the exchange monitors their liquidations. And so they're going to make sure that you have the product that you intend to deliver, or that you have the capacity to take the product that you're talking about, or they're going to get you out of that contract in an orderly way before the contract goes to delivery. And the important point there is that warrants additional flexibility in that 5-day period, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to chase the hedgers out of that important spot month period, because that's how price convergence works with having commercials in that part of the market. And if you drove them out, what you'd be left with are speculators in that period, and that's not what you want for orderly pricing of the contracts.
So before we go to David, Ken, I was talking to Ken on the sidebar to clarify a question that I had, which is I was talking about sort of what would staff be looking at in order to evaluate the hedge, and I think Ken presented the other perspective is we're really focused on how you would evaluate it. Where is it important to you? Where do you draw those lines? Sort of, back to this dynamic evaluation. How do these businesses make sense of where you get involved in cross commodities? But let's go to David.
Let me just say before I answer that question, the 5-day rule really does require focus and attention, as Ron pointed out, and it's a little bit off topic, but we shouldn't forget that. You said before, Vince, you said art and science, and I think
just as a question.
Well, I liked it, and the real way to look at, from my client's perspective, of cross commodity hedge is that it's an art. Because if they could get a perfect hedge that was right on with their risk, they would take it. And a cross-commodity hedge is sort of a second best. So that what they have to do is find something that works for them in the event that there isn't a good match. And it isn't just the question of, is the product available? There's pricing issues, there's liquidity issues, there's all kinds of things that go with this question. One example I can give you to look at is natural gas liquids. They had been hedgeable in I think a pretty good correlation, at least I'm told, with WTI, and that, because of the natural gas revolution, et cetera, has diverged. So the folks who are looking to hedge these things, they have to find something that works. You can get quotes on natural gas liquid swaps. Now that's from a swap dealer. they're going to charge you a significant cost for that because there's really not the liquidity that you would otherwise want. So the individual who is a seasoned market person who is charged with hedging is going to have to make a judgment. Since we don't have the answer that we want, we want to hedge, or maybe not because of the expense, we have to pick the best tool that we have, and we will use our judgment and our professional experience to do that, and the market will give us feedback as well, as we've said. In time, you could find out it was perfect or it wasn't perfect, but going into it, it's more, I understand, of an art than a science, and to cap it with an 80% correlation just makes it very difficult to have something that will qualify.
Well then, so there would be an expectation or a request that the determination by the firm that there is a cross-commodity hedge is a presumption. A presumption that that's accurate. So how do I evaluate?
Well,
how can I objectively evaluate that qualitative determination?
Well, it's hard to objectively evaluate something that's inherently subjective in certain ways because of the imperfection of the market here, but these people have to deal with the market on a real-time basis. And I think one of the things that we could have is that, as we've all talked about, there is nothing but documentation internal to these organizations to demonstrate that the activity that's undertaken is for the purpose of hedging. And maybe one thing we could do is we could have a presumption that it is hedging, and it has got some level of correlation in the product mix, okay. But it could be subject to audit or some other after-the-fact review to have the commission assure itself that the entity that was undertaking this cross-commodity hedge, which is, again, based upon its judgment, was in fact taken for the purpose of hedging.
Let's go to Lael and then Matt.
Sure. I need to comment on this because cross-commodity hedging is just necessary in the electricity industry, where there is just an undeniable relationship between the price of electricity and the price of the fuels that generate that electricity. In certain markets at certain times, the price of the fuel is going to set the price of electricity in those markets. If it's a time where gas generators are setting the market price for electricity, the price of gas is going to correlate very closely with the price of electricity. The bottom line is that throughout the electricity industry, the relationship between fuel prices, the prices of the fuel commodities and the price of electricity have been correlated. You look at the polar vortex. You look at what FERC has done in the aftermath of the polar vortex, really exploring the interconnected relationship between how the gas markets work and how the electricity markets work, making big changes to reflect the need to have a much closer unison between the way the physical gas and physical power markets work. Many of the electricity products reflect this correlation. We have heat rate products, which we describe in our letter, and I may talk about later. But these are electricity products or even financial products that are priced based on the relationship between fuel and electricity. We have tolling agreements or leases of electricity generators that are also priced often based on the cost of the fuel that would generate those facilities. But the bottom line, to get to what Vince said, is we are using cross-commodity hedges. Typically, we'll go to the liquid product. We'll go to the markets that are the most available to us. Out the curve, further forward than the spot month, we're probably going to use gas or something that's more liquid to hedge our electricity. As we're moving closer to the spot month, if there's liquidity in the electricity financial products, we may move the hedge into something that's more closely correlated. But the bottom line is, and I talked about this before, we have risk managers that are looking at our physical risk exposure, our financial risk exposure every single day. They are studying these correlations. If these correlations diverge, we're losing money. We're not hedging effectively. And our risk management group is going to tell the traders, get a better hedge. Okay, so we have the built-in infrastructure in place. John Parsons talked about that. It's already in place at many of our companies. We're looking at these correlations. We're looking at the effectiveness of hedges. And as I said before, I think the CFTC is often interpreting complexity as a potential loophole, but I really think you should be looking at complexity as, complexity demands flexibility because these markets are complex. We're managing risk of various things in various regions. Prices are changing all the time. It is very complex what our traders and risk managers do, and they need the flexibility to be able to do it effectively, consistent with the industry practice.
Thanks, though. Before we go to Matt, Ken had a comment.
Just a quick question here. Again, this whole issue with cross-commodity hedging is really only focused on the last few trading days of the physical delivery contract. So why is there a need to precisely hedge to the final settlement price in the physical delivery contract if the hedge is a ballpark cross-commodity hedge? For example, why wouldn't a commercial enterprise try to lock in electricity supply prices, hedge in short-dated electricity contracts, whether derivative or cash forward, and get out of the physical delivery natural gas futures contracts as the natural gas futures contracts approach expiration?
I can answer that real quickly. Sure. And sorry, you talked about electricity, so I'll just answer real quickly. I think we would if we could. I mean, I think we're going to seek the best hedge, the most liquid product to hedge our risk. So if there is liquidity in the electricity product in the prompt month, spot month, sure, we'll use that. As I mentioned before, there are times where gas is setting the price of electricity in certain markets during certain times of the year based on weather events. And in those situations, gas is a perfectly well correlated hedge to keep into the spot month period. So again, it's less about, it's about preserving the flexibility, not limiting the ability and the variety of ways that our risk managers can manage risk.
Is it a hedge if you don't have production facilities?
No, that's a different question.
Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, I don't see it as just an issue for the last few days of the expiring contract. If some of the cross-commodity relationships that I mentioned before were not permitted, we wouldn't be able to recognize them across the curve with respect to any and all month limits, and so it's a problem there as well.
So let's go to Matt. He's been patient.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you. If I think about the way the actual expiration process works today, and you have the exchanges with the Oversight, as well as Vince and his team with the Oversight. I mean, in the starting even with first notice day, and going into the expiration in many of the commodities and contracts where we operate, there is an increasing amount of dialogue between the commercial and the Oversight on, okay, this is your position this morning. How do you see the market dynamics today? And so in terms of your question about how do you evaluate that, I believe that process is in place today and it works. And that dialogue, I think, if you find, is actually quite direct and to the point. And as you go into the actual expiration, there's an increasingly amount of dialogue that works. Okay, what are the economics today? What are the alternatives? And that is a process that I think serves very well. And so I just wanted to respond to your question about how do you analyze that. It's literally on a case by case basis, because as so many have pointed out that there are lots of dynamic inputs that influence these different commodities. But at the moment and that as the expiration is occurring, that's between the let's say the hedger or the regulatory, whether it's the exchange or Vince, you and your team, that dialogue is I think works well.
Thanks. We're going to go to anticipatory merchandising in a second. Joe, your card was up.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch briefly when you're talking about the qualitative, quantitative tests that were there. And I would suggest that the quantitative test not only is not necessary, but is actually the actual opposite of what it is that you should be looking at, because it's not a matter that the correlations must remain stagnant or static to where it is, because the breakdown in the correlation is in and of itself a reason to use cross-commodity hedging. If you took an example, and Mike touched on some of the simpler ones, if you had corn having to compete with wheat, the corn-wheat ratio very well may break down But that's because it's either trying to force feed wheat into the marketplace or it's trying to do the opposite. Another perfect example would be in the vegetable oils around the globe. The fact that the relationship between soy oil and canola or rape or palm may break down from the 0.8 or whatever you may consider to be necessary might be the exact reason why, if we were trying to price out soy oil in the world because of a shortage of supply, then the canolas and the rapeseeds and others who become cheaper, you would want to buy those, hedge them in soy, because then you can go to the end user, and as those spreads have become wider, cause the substitutability, the elasticity of demand. And the only way to lock that in to allow you to present that to them is to be able to buy the cheaper product, hedge in the more expensive product, and then allow the elasticity of this demand to narrow those arbs.
So would you leave it as an indicator for making a determination, a quantitative factor, but not a requirement?
I think it's more of a reasonableness test that's appropriate. It should be able to, if someone can show you the need and or the reasoning behind why the one is as you would call it, a risk mitigant factor of why the ability to buy canola and then sell soy oil is a relationship that most of the relationships are very obvious. That exist, and some of them may be in a little bit more explaining of why someone with an ethanol plant may be buying corn and selling RBOB or something, to the extent that from there to ethanol to the substitution into gas makes perfect sense at one point in time. So I think it's much more of a reasonableness test, probably more than it is a quantitative test.
In your example about with market prices being high and low in different commodity groups, another perspective on that is, in a way, you're requesting a hedge exemption to speculate on the cross-commodity spread between these two different commodities.
Well, in some of them, though, because they're different commodities in and of themselves, don't mean they're not in the same space. But even when those that leave space from one to, say, corn to ethanol, or corn to even eventually to, say, an RBOB, it is a product of conversion that takes place where you eventually reach that through the commodity and value chain. So there is this relationship, and the difference there is you have conversion costs, that's your asset that takes place, you have your marketing costs, and at times the market will adjust, and our ability to move our hedges between commodities is something that's very prudent to do. It's not adding speculation, it's actually doing what the marketplace is asking us for. If there's too much ethanol relative to the demand at one point in time versus gasoline, the basis, again, this word basis, is going to break down between those two. When the basis gets really cheap, that is a signal to go ahead and store the ethanol. But the way to lock that in, if you want to store the ethanol against a higher price against the substituted gasoline, is you have to lock in the other side of that hedge in order so that you know that when the relationship comes back to a normal blend situation, you'll be able to capture that arbitrage. Because otherwise, you're just accepting the lower price of ethanol at that time without the ability to be able to lock in what you can do better with your product.
Oh, but I think that's the basic question here. If you're talking about arbitrage, capturing arbitrage differentials versus hedging, then the question is when you took those positions, was it really a speculation in a sense? And you can view it as a hedge, perhaps, but there might have been, it might not be fully risk reducing, it might value neutral in a sense. And so you're able to take those positions to essentially capture that spread differential.
Yeah, but I don't consider that speculating at all. It's what is normally done in the norm of our business. That is our business. That is what we do. So the ability to prevent our assets from losing money, to being able to respond to the market call, to either hold back product, to store it, or to create more of it, is exactly, we have to be able to lock in the other side of the transaction.
So this really, what Ken's bringing up is that we're going to have to ascertain, we or the exchange has to ascertain, when is it speculation versus when is it hedging. You talked about a reasonableness test, but at some point along the way, somebody's going to have to make a decision, make a determination. And what we're trying to get here is, in a sense, tools. What do we use? It's been mentioned that the quantitative test is a little too rigid. And the qualitative, and then it's mentioned reasonableness. And so basically it gets back to what are the standards? Are you suggesting that we put it back into the hands of the exchange because they have the experience? Are you suggesting that we come up with a test, we have a test that is a useful test? And what would that reasonableness test involve? I mean, basically what it gets down to is, as been pointed out, we have to make this, we have to understand what are we looking at, what are we dealing with, and how do we ascertain what it is. And so our questions go to, when what Ken's bringing up is, when we look at it, it may not be clear to us when we're at, really, there is an intent to reduce risk, there is intent to manage risk.
How do you know today that it was a hedge, but tomorrow it was a spec position, right? I mean, today it was a cross commodity hedge, but then tomorrow it's, really, boss, I really want to speculate on that derivative position, but I've got this physical here. And so when you show it to the commission, it'll look like a hedge, but really your intent was to speculate. How do you differentiate them between those two scenarios?
I think it's important to realize that when you try to identify a hedge, no matter even if it was the most perfect hedge, you're buying corn in Illinois and you're selling corn futures, that in and of itself is a form of speculation, because it is a change, it is a hedge, because you're changing your outright ownership to a basis ownership. You may call it speculation, we would call it hedging. Someone else would just say, well, all you've done is change your risk profile from one of outright to one of relative. Right? It's a change in risk profile. The ability to get more right down to your point of how you try to identify speculation would probably be from the standpoint if the transaction has absolutely no underlying cross relationship or no underlying cross quantity justification. That's your answer.
So change is a good word to move on to the next topic. And let's look at anticipatory hedging and focused on merchandising. We want to get perspectives about how we could, the commission could consider a hedge exemption surrounding merchandising, and how do we, anticipatory merchandising, and how do we deal with the real challenge of articulating the satisfaction of the economic purpose test at the merchandising, looking at potential contracts down the line as giving a basis today to establish a position. Anyone wants to take that on? Thanks.
Ed Prosser. I think at the heart of this, the commission should, at this point, start to get a sense that this end user class, this physical merchant, it's kind of a messy business. It's not cut and dry. Things don't correlate well. There are a lot of risks that we are trying to offset inside of our businesses. If we had a enumerated product on a DCM for each one of our risks, we could 100% hedge, go on down the road, and everything would be happy. But unfortunately, that's not the real world we live in. We also don't just deal with price risks. We deal with weather risks. We deal with the quantity risk. We deal with quality risk. We deal with location risks. All of those risks we bring to the table, and we are moved into a few different enumerated commodities to try to offset those risks. We have developed strategies over decades to try to offset those risks on the exchanges. We use time spreads to lock in carries. We use time spreads at times to offset weather risk. But all of these are a part of the function where overall we feel like using those particular contracts reduce our risk from where we were if we weren't using them. Sometimes the correlations aren't as good as we'd like them to be, but they're the best alternative that we have. The other thing I'd like to point out is by doing this activity, these physical merchants that have 1 foot on the physical side and 1 foot in the derivative do the good work of flipping those instruments with economic signals to bring convergence and price discovery to the marketplace, which is the most important function of all of these markets. As we have each of those buckets, the opportunity to be in each of those sides simultaneously or alternatively, it is very easy for me to determine, you know what, today the derivative is my best choice. Tomorrow the derivative goes back and it goes away and I go back into the physical market. And that goes on thousands of times, and ultimately it proves the great public good of converging the derivative to the cash. And that's what we do in this space. And it's a big part of that is this anticipatory merchandising, anticipatory processing function that we use today.
Mike.
Thank you. You know, when it comes down to the anticipated, I mean, grain companies and probably energy companies too, you know, we're continually putting out bids to producers, offers to consumers on a real-time, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis. And we don't have the luxury of telling a farmer when he can sell to us, nor do we have the luxury of telling a consumer when they can buy. They're the ones that hold the leverage. They make the decision. So, like all firms, you are analyzing that risk on a continual basis. And I think some of the rulemaking basically said, how can you hedge a risk that you haven't incurred yet by writing a contract? But by putting that firm bid out there and that firm offer, every firm is going to assign some probability to that. And those probabilities are going to change day to day, hour to hour. By sitting back and not managing those risks, one of two things are going to happen. First is that all of a sudden that risk premium goes up. Let's just say if it's going into a big harvest weekend and we know we're going to buy a lot of corn and we have the ability to pre-hedge those purchases because the market's not open on Saturday or Sunday, then we can stand in and buy that corn. If we're not allowed to pre-hedge, then either we can't buy the corn or we have to put a risk premium on it. Same thing when we're making an offer. A significant offer to a large sovereign entity, to a large food company. By assigning probabilities, and we're continually working on that, and that's another reason why we can't do it on an enterprise level, because these are all localized decisions based on, you know, the wisdom of the people and the experience of people. What are those probabilities? And again, to manage those risks, if we would wait, you know, until we consume that large sale and then hedge, well, that has the potential to be more volatile, more price disruptive, and it also is going to carry a bigger risk premium. So I mean, it's kind of the nature of the business because we're continually putting out a for sale sign and a buy sign.
Kristen?
Yes, I would just echo the comments of my colleagues here, but I wanted to give you a simple example. So if we've had an unpriced contract, if we've had a sale that is not a fixed price contract, we still have a legally binding obligation to deliver that grain. And so if we are going to look at the market and the market today is not converged, maybe the futures market is the cheapest source for us to purchase that grain. So we would go out and put a contract on, futures contract, as an anticipatory hedge that we know we're going to buy. I would say it's not even anticipatory. We know that we have this obligation to deliver the grain. We know we're going to buy it. And back to Joe's point, we don't have that flat price risk, but we have that relative value of the futures price that we have agreed to use in the future with the customer that's buying the grain, and the cash price today that's not converged, the May futures contract potentially that we would be buying as a hedge. What we would do in that situation would be to sell the deferred contract and buy the current contract if it's cheaper to do that, and that's risk reducing for us because it's locking in that spread.
I just wanted to tee up a very simple hypothetical on anticipatory merchandising or processing. So again, I want to abstract from the very complex world that you operate in and just think about this. So we've got a firm that's started up. They have no sales, no fixed price sales, no fixed price purchases, no inventory whatsoever. They then decide what they anticipate selling a lot of, or merchandising in the future, anticipate selling a lot of product in the future. And as a result, they go out and put on 100,000 contracts in corn, in the corn futures contract, the physical delivery contract. And then they go to CME or the CFTC and they say, well, this is a bona fide hedge because we anticipate selling this product forward. And so my question to you, and I want you to think about this, I guess, during the break, and then we can come back and talk about it, is this reducing risk for this firm, or is it increasing risk?
So Ken comes back to the economic purpose test, but I know Joe had his card up.
Thank you. In regards to the anticipatory hedging as well as the inclusion of merchandising. Couple of comments. One is currently the statute had merchandising in and was then removed for the question of whether it should be replaced or not. But it clearly also stated besides merchandising, processing, producing, end users, where it recognizes the need for anticipatory hedging. But even within that, a processor, an end user, after conversion is a merchandiser because they have to sell their product, they have to market their product, transport it, store it. They make all those decisions that are being done completely as a merchandiser. So even within the realms of what you have, their activities are merchandising activities, which clearly are acceptable within the statute that's there. I think one of the other things that's important, and we were mentioning again about the ability, it's also the definition of what is an anticipatory hedge. Because I would echo what we just heard, the ability to go ahead and procure supply against a fully committed sale, the fact that it is a relatively price risk as opposed to an absolutely price risk is not anticipatory at all. That boat is showing up, and you better put grain in it or you are in default. And the fact that he's not going to price it to the day or two before that boat shows up in no way removes the obligation that we have to perform in order to move our farmers' grains into that boat from where it is there. It is simply not an anticipatory hedge whatsoever. It is a normal course of business.
I think we have, in getting back to Kristen's hypothetical or real-world scenario, a couple of specific items after the break that we want to get into, sort of unpackage that a little bit more. Ron and Ed, as between you two, I don't know who had the card up, so you take us to the break, Ron.
Okay, thanks. I'll be very quick. Two things. First is, you look at the question and you say, is there a basis for granting an exemption for an anticipatory merchandising transaction that establishes price risk? What you've heard around the table is they don't establish price risk, they mitigate price risk. And so the question's backwards, and all of the comments here are that these transactions reduce risk. The other point I wanted to make was, with respect to Ken's question, is that there's a process that is in place that works and that should mitigate any concern that Ken has. Okay, on the federal level, if you're going to use an anticipated production hedge exemption or an anticipated requirements exemption, you apply in advance. In the energy space, where we're not under a federal regime, we go to the NYMEX and we make a case. So if we're brand new and we have no contracts, we have no employees, and we never chartered a ship, NYMEX might look at us and say, you're crazy. You're not getting a hedge exemption for that. But if we've been in business and we have the right staffing, we have the right systems, and we can demonstrate that there's a real probability that we're going to be doing that business, we might convince them. And on top of that, they have the ability to say, you know what? We don't like 100,000. That doesn't work in this market context. You can have an exemption to 50. I don't know what the corn levels are, but the point is they have the ability to moderate that, and we'd have that going forward, even under the new federal limits for energies and other physical commodities.
Great. So let's go. Tom.
Just real quick to echo Ron's words. That what he said was accurate, Vince. In that very, very scripted, tight hypothetical that Ken put out, the likelihood of an exemption there with, we just started up, we've done nothing. Now let us get that exemption? No, that's impractical. But where you've demonstrated, I have sold and distributed this history, that is frankly what we look at. And it is, and again, just to state for the record, regardless of what the underlying exposure is for any exemption, I think that exemptions are not just simply blanket, meaning that, yes, you're exempt, go at your free will, unbridled, enjoy. It doesn't simply work like that. We look at what the liquidity profiles are in the market. Even if you have requisite exposure, we look at what the open interest is, what the liquidation patterns have been in the contract to make sure that we're not granting an exemption that gives someone undue concentration or control. So there's quite a bit of review process around what you grant in terms of exemptions, modifying the ask down, tiering those numbers down.
Okay, and I appreciate that, Tom. So we're going to we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll have about 45 minutes. We want to talk about testing firm bids or offers, synthetic fixings, unpriced physical purchase or sales, and then a process surrounding whether there should be an unenumerated hedge exemption review and we'll try and do that within 45 minutes. It's about 5 after 11. If we can come back at 20 after 11, that would be great. Thank you. So before we went into the break, we talked about some specific, we wanted to get into some specific examples. And again, a focus here from our perspective, from the staff's point of view, is we really want to get into the details and get as concrete an understanding about how best to evaluate these issues, how these risks are evaluated at the firm, how that information can be reviewed by the agency, so we can make meaningful decisions with recommendations with respect to this rulemaking. So as concrete as you can be during the remainder of the session is of course very helpful. I do want to turn it to Ken to walk through some of these specific hypotheticals or scenarios on hedging to get your perspectives on where we can draw some lines.
So I think what we can do is we can draw together one of the comments by Joe and then another comment by Kristen with respect to hedging unfixed price contracts. So the specific question on the table here is, can you hedge unfixed price contracts, forward commitments to supply or purchase with fixed price future contracts? Or alternatively, would it be better to hedge those unfixed price forward commitments with another unfixed price commitment? And so what I'd like to do is to help us think about that is to draw on the experience of CME and look to Tom and say, Tom, what's your thoughts? What is on hedging basis risk, basis contracts with fixed price futures contracts?
Ken, in the enumerated space, I believe that we are bound to have both the legs, like the purchase of the basis tied with the sale. So you could have basically a spread if you're buying basis on one month, selling basis on another month. We look for the pairing. That's in the enumerated space, I think that I would say that that's the standard that Joe Harris's team would abide by.
You're right. So there is an example in CFTC regs that focuses on basis contracts in different delivery months. But I want to focus on just a very simple, again, it's helpful to focus on the most simple possible example because our complex world is built up on simple things. So if you have an unfixed price contract in 1 month, right, out the curve some point in time, can you hedge that unfixed price commitment with a fixed price future, fixed price contract?
You get an unfixed purchase somewhere out the curve?
Sure, yeah. So you've promised to purchase corn 6 months out based on whatever the futures price will be at that particular point in time.
And you want
can you hedge that with a futures contract? So that's the question.
Is the hedge that you're looking to sell futures?
Sure. I mean, in this particular case, or purchase, that's whatever you think is appropriate here.
Again, I'd question maybe the sale isn't that obvious to me in that hypothetical, but if in fact you purchased futures in connection with it, and there was another sale of futures that somehow represented something that was along an anticipatory line, I think that package could be something that would be acceptable.
I think Joe and Kristen were saying was that when you've got unfixed price commitments to purchase, what you'd want to do is I think what they talked about is hedge that risk through the fixing of making sure that you have commitments to satisfy or to get rid of that risk. And the way to do that is through potentially through futures. So maybe Joe could help us out on what his thoughts are, and maybe Kristen.
Yeah, I'd like to take you through a real life example, and maybe it's a little long, so please excuse that. But let us start with we sell 500,000 tons to the Chinese, unfixed for January delivery out of the Gulf. Now, at that point in time, all we have is an unfixed sale. but we know that it is a real commitment that we have to go through. Yeah, all right, so now let's go ahead and cover that, because your question is there are different ways to cover that. So let's cover them all and see what should happen and see what the differences are. So the first day I go in, and let's say I've sold, not to get too complicated, but let's just say that I've sold it at 90 over the January. I go into the barge market, and I'm able to buy barges that next day at 82, so I buy them. And they may be on call, so I buy some quantity, that's fine. The next day, there are barges offered to me at $12.50, which equate to 88 over. I buy it at $12.50. I sell the January. That's a proper hedge. You would say that that's okay. The next day, I move on to the Illinois River. Somebody offers me 90 over down there. I buy them from them on call. You say that's okay. Then I tell you, by the way, oh, by the way, yesterday, those 90 that I bought on call, that 90 on delivered, they happen to be registered delivery stocks. But I bought them from the elevator or the owner in the elevator who just happened to sell them to me at 90 over. You'd say that's fine. The next day, I turn around and I buy some more, and I buy them at $12.50, and I hedge them in the January at 90 over. And I turn around and tell you, oh, those that I bought at 90 were also delivery stocks, but I bought them through the CME, because the elevator operator who had those other stocks now wanted 95. So I bought them because they were cheaper, but they were the seller through the exchange. But in order to buy them through the exchange, I needed a long November future. You tell me no. You don't have the right to have a long November future in order to procure your cash. I can buy the same grain from the same person yesterday, and you say it's fine. But because I bought it for him through the exchange, you tell me I cannot do that. That is not logical. So I do need the ability to be able to have a futures position, to be able to procure my grain. And in that particular case, what we would do is we would buy November, sell January. That would be the equivalent, because it ends up, when it comes to fruition and delivery, it turns into a basis trade that offsets our delivery risk. But since it is the cheapest source of cash, it is the equivalent of buying cash at that point in time, and thus it is a legitimate hedge and a reason to have it done that way.
Kristen, did you want to follow up with any comments there?
No, I would say I agree with that example. I think in our example too, what we were saying is if we have this legally binding obligation to deliver and it's the cheapest route to do that, we will do that. Again, we would sell, in his example, the January by the November. But in our case, we would say if the that would be if the market is not converged. If the market then converges, we will get out of that spread position. We'd buy back the January, sell out the November, and then go into the cash market and buy that. But in our example too, if we're pricing with the Chinese in January, we likely have agreed with them that we will take an exchange of futures. We know we're going to get a long futures position from that Chinese customer, and we're just shorting that. It will be covered when we've priced the contract. So, in our example, we're saying this is happening when it's not converged, and we believe that we're reducing the risk that we have, and we're also promoting convergence in the market.
And to add on to that real quickly, in that same example that I used, if the very following day the Chinese priced their contract, where it turned to fixed and we had the futures, which is exactly the same, it is a basis contract, exactly the same as it was the day before. The next day when I came to you and said I'm going to procure my beans on the November, you would say okay, because now it's a fixed price with a future versus being on call, which are exactly the same things, but you draw that distinction between the two when the relevance to us is exactly the same. There is absolutely no difference between those two sets of parameters.
Tim?
Yeah, I just want to say, at ICE Futures US, we have both enumerated and non-enumerated ags, and the type of transaction you're describing and that Joe just described in grains is something we see all the time in coffee, sugar, and cocoa, and we have for years. We've been able to document the bona fide nature of the unfixed price call, sale, or purchase, but we've routinely used them and seen them work well for hedge exemption purposes and for purposes of managing the risk that the commercial parties have. So it would not be unusual at all in those spaces.
You want to go to Kristen, and then to Lael?
Yeah, I wanted to point out also, I think further to what he was saying, in our example, if the market isn't converged, even if we had that fixed price contract on that July sale, we would take exactly the same action. We would sell out the January and buy the November if it was the cheapest option. So it would be no difference to us the way we would hedge that if it was unpriced versus priced in a market that wasn't converged.
So we're asking back and forth here, and it's come up a couple of times, is, so in looking at these hedge exemptions, are we focused on price risk or some performance risk, and what is the intention of the hedge? And so, we're not talking in a number of these instances about price risk. You're talking about, or are you talking about performance obligations? And so how do I get your concerns about whether you're going to get your product or be able to deliver your product, risk concerns surrounding who the counterparties are, on to an idea of evaluating whether you've increased risk and are therefore not entitled to seek an exemption for that reason?
A simple, to tee up the hypothetical here, or an example, which is the combination of an unfixed price contract and a fixed price contract, in these examples that you're working through, basically the same thing as just buying a fixed price contract. In other words, with a fixed price contract, when the prices change in the market, the value of that contract changes. But with an unfixed price contract, the value of that contract isn't really changing. There's no real price risk. What you've got is performance risk. And so what you have is, with unfixed price contracts, you've got concerns about the performance on that contract. And so what you want to do is, from a hedging perspective, is match up those risks. And a way to do that, and I'm looking for your thoughts on this, is the way to do this with hedging that unfixed price commitment with another unfixed price contract, rather than a fixed price contract, which would seem to establish price risk. Or am I getting it wrong?
So, I mean, I want to look at it from the aspect of a purchaser of an unfixed price physical forward. And, and I think if you're a purchaser of a physical commodity at an index price, you have price risk that you should be able to hedge. So, for example, if I am an electric generator, I have a fuel requirement that I need to fill. I may enter into an unfixed price physical contract to lock in my supply and make sure I have the supply risk taken care of. But just because I've locked in my supply risk and taken care of that, I still have price risk, because that forward physical futures contract for fuel is at a variable index-based price. I have price risk in the future, and even though it's unfixed, and I as a generator should be able to hedge that risk and lock it in when I see the opportunity to.
Does everybody agree with that? I mean, is that all unfixed price contracts have price risk? I mean, is that the consensus here?
From a purchaser standpoint, absolutely.
Let's go to John.
Yeah, so if you break this hypothetical of the supply into two pieces, which is the contract to sell and the obligation to purchase, clearly the obligation to purchase, whenever you enter into the future, you are reducing the risk, right? Because you have an obligation at an unfixed price. The moment you execute the futures contract, you've reduced the risk on that one half of the obligation. It is true, though, that you've left yourself wide open on what are you going to receive for the stuff that you're procuring. So, I see where you're coming from. The total risk is higher, but that was true the moment you made, in the hypothetical he constructed, the moment you did the unfixed price sale, you created this risk. Now, when you go and procure a piece of it using something that is deliverable on the contract, on the futures market at a fixed price, you are reducing the risk on the procurement, but you're not reducing your total risk.
So it seems like, just you disagree with their ideas on that it is a risk-reducing transaction.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to find a way to incorporate what people are saying and clarify. It's clearly a mechanism for procuring your supplies. So you're going out and doing it, and what they're looking to do is do that at the cheapest price. You are not reducing your total risk exposure.
Ed?
I'd like to first point out that the best way to start a speculative trade is not to sell 500,000 tons of soybeans to the Chinese. Ken, if there was a perfect hedge, if there was a basis-only trade, is what we would call it, or a non-fixed entity or trade option out there, we could use that. We spent all this year in Dodd-Frank trying to make sure that we get back on exchange. Surely we're not wanting to push us back off into non-enumerated commodities in the ag space. I mean, I think what we're trying to get across, I hope we're getting across this idea that we're on this continual search for the best hedge that we have. And a lot of these times, we make the choice of between the best of two bad options. But it does reduce our risk because we do have an obligation. Certainly when that boat shows up in New Orleans, we got to load it. And there are opportunities to mitigate some of that. Is it perfect? No, but it's the best that we have today.
So looking at the example that you started with, so where would you put out markers for identification that, you know, there's actually going to be an offsetting transaction that that justifies establishing this, you know, someone referred to earlier, this pre-hedge? How are we going to articulate that in this anticipatory world? What should we be looking for, and how the firm is managing its business, and how you're representing that that need for the hedge to us?
I'll let Joe finish, but I would think that
number of flags up now. Yeah.
In the beginning, all of those things that we've talked about so often, the 204s, the process we go through with our DCMs on hedge exemptions. Again, if you are a new company and just show up with a non-fixed hedge, the CBOT is going to start to ask questions. Have you ever done this business before? What are you trying to do? I think there are processes.
So the facts and circumstances approach effectively. I mean, that's what we're hearing.
In Gavilan's opinion, yes.
Yeah. David, Joe, and then we'll go to Mike.
I'm going to make a very quick comment, and just in furtherance of Lael's example, because in the energy world, in the purchase scenario he was describing, very often the unfixed supply sale is from a counterparty that doesn't have a strong balance sheet. So if you could get a firm fixed price from them, that'd be fine if you were comfortable with their credit. Because if they defaulted, you're not going to be able to get the mark-to-market value that you would get because of the credit concerns, and you're not going to be able to do that deal. So you could bifurcate and actually do a overall risk mitigating transaction by buying at spot market from someone who is a logistically capable supplier who's going to have no issue supplying you something at spot market and getting it to your location. And then you go to the exchange and you hedge that with a hedge that is going to be credit completely bulletproof. So you've got both pieces matched up. You have your supply at a very reliable manner brought to you, but you couldn't fix that price and rely on that supplier. And then you have a way to fix your price and resolve the credit issues you would otherwise have with the supplier, and you've reduced overall risk, pardon me.
I heard you say something slightly different than what we started out with, which was you have an unfixed price commitment, and then you went and fixed that price through a spot contract, and then you hedged that price risk associated with that fixed price spot contract with futures.
I was commenting on Lael's example, which was you were making an unfixed purchase, and then you were effectively, that existed, and then you were fixing that price with the futures.
Joe?
In response to your two questions, let me handle the one that you just asked, which was how are you able to look at the need or the ability to make a determination about that hedge being proper or not? And you have that information currently that is available. You will receive, in order to be able to have that to justify its position, there's two things. The cash market will have to converge, that the delivery market is a cheaper source of supply, either due to time, location, price, quality. And the other thing is that you have an offsetting need. So if you turn around and you're long 20 million bushels at the Gulf as opposed to short 20 million bushels at the Gulf, it's two very different needs of what it is that you have. You have that information available so that you would be able to see that and determine it. To the other question that Ken had asked about is it a risk-reducing transaction? And in this case, I fully disagree with John. It's absolutely a risk-reducing transaction. As a matter of fact, when you bring it to the end, it completely closes it out to zero. So your ability to take the November, sell the Jan, that is the same thing as buying 90 over at the Gulf. The fact that you bought it through the exchange because it was a cheaper source of supply should in no way have anything to do with changes of risk. It's not taking on flat price risk. It's substituting a purchase of basis for the other, because by being long the NOVE, when looked at only the NOVE, looks like you're just going long 1 month and it's flat price. But if you have offsetting other positions of whether it is a sold January, a sold March, you have it as a basis contract, and that is a almost perfect mitigant against that basis sale that you have.
I mean, I don't want to speak for John, but I'm going to think that John's going to say something like this, which is that when you do that fixed price contract, which is the quote unquote risk reducing transaction, in this case a long futures contract, if the price of that long futures contract goes down, then you suffer a loss on that position.
No, you don't, because you're offset against the short against the Jan. So as they go down, you make it back against the January. So the November goes down, you lose, but you're short the Jan against it. You've locked in 90 off. That's exactly what we do when we hedge. That's the basis. So there is absolutely no flat price risk in that scenario whatsoever.
Okay. Maybe other comments?
Yeah, Kristen and Mike.
No, I would say the same thing. And in John's example, I would agree if the only thing we were doing was going long the November. But in the situation we're talking about, going long the November and going short in the January is risk reducing. We're completely offsetting both legs of that transaction. So it is risk reducing.
Mike?
Yeah, I would be redundant at this stage because those were the points I was going to make. If you have a unpriced sale, is it appropriate to hedge it with a flat price futures? No. Is it appropriate to hedge it with a spread position, long the nearby, short the next month? Absolutely. Is it appropriate to carry that long nearby futures position offset with the short and the deferred into delivery and use that as a way to fulfill that sale if that is the cheapest source of cash? Absolutely. That's how these markets work. And to deny that just because whether a contract is priced or not is purely happenstance. It's the buyer's right to decide when to price. I mean, it's how they manage their risk. So whether that's priced or not, it's a commitment, and that's all people are trying to say.
Ron?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First is calendar month average pricing wasn't in your series of questions, but this discussion goes, almost identically to that. And so, if we want to move on and just park that one and recognize it when you go back and analyze whether or not to grant that exemption. The other point I wanted to make, and it's, I love hearing the traders talk about it because they do so in ways I can't. But, what I'm hearing, and I think it's appropriate to pull back just a little bit, is the questions in this discussion and in the one on cross commodity was really about the subjective valuation of the quality of the hedge and not at all about use of anything for excessive speculation. And I think it's really important, again, that we pull back and we think about what these rules are here for and what they're intended to protect, and whether or not it fits in exactly a definition that exists and has existed for, in the statute for, tens and decades and scores of years, isn't really the question. The question is whether or not the Commission should recognize it today. And I think the overwhelming answer that you hear from the commercial side is it has to.
We're about ready to go to the second panel. you all are participating in the second panel, so please don't get up. But before we do that, we want to check, is there any area, or the conversation today on hedging that we've missed or that needs to be underscored? Ron just brought up one other item that we hadn't talked about. I just want to touch that base now as you're thinking about what we've discussed this morning. If you have any sort of final short remarks, let's get those.
Mine will be real short. I hope our panel today has been able to provide you with enough information of why you need to re-include merchandising into the statute language. Thank you.
David.
Riva had asked at one point, should we let the exchanges make these decisions? Well, how should we deal with these things? And my answer to that question is yes. They're doing a great job today in using, in the non-enumerated space, their knowledge and understanding, and to have the dialogue with the folks who are seeking the exemptions. And if there's any way that expertise can continue under the new regime at the federal level as well as at their level, that would be much appreciated.
I just want to reiterate that, again, that our companies have risk management teams that are analyzing and assessing these risks every day. And again, if we're not doing it right, if a trader's not hedging properly or doing it right, he's losing money for the firm and he's not doing his job, and there's going to be consequences. But please do not limit alternatives, do not limit ways that companies like ours can manage risk. At the end of the day, when you limit ways to manage risks, that is going to be reflected in higher prices for end-use consumers.
Anyone else? Yeah. Okay, so let me move to the second panel, and what I like about the second panel is it talks about a process for non-enumerated exemptions, and so in my mind that means we figured everything else out, and now we're looking to see what else needs to be done on a going forward basis. On the notice of proposed rulemaking, there was some commentary about how to handle sort of transparency, transparency goal for determining further exemptions. And so we put forth to the panel today this question about whether we should reserve back Regulation 1.47, and if we reserve back an opportunity for individual requests for non-enumerated exemption, how can we do that in a way that informs, how can we best do that in a way that informs the public? So I'll sort of start with that general policy question and solicit your comments about whether and how we should reserve 147. Go ahead, Ron.
I'll take a shot. I think you have to look at it in two ways, and I may not offer you a solution to both ways, but you have to look at it in two ways. Some of the requests under 147 are for systemic types of changes, structural changes, things that new types of transactions that hadn't been considered before, as they have been in the past. Most of the requests were for hedging swap risk in ways that it hadn't been done before. And those are sort of, I don't know what the right word is for it, but maybe call it a class exemption. And those I could see the need and the benefit from a public comment type process. But when you look at the things we've been discussing today and the things that were in the working group's petition, those will come up on a transaction by transaction basis. And there's just not time, opportunity, or really an appropriate need for subjecting those to public comment and for subjecting those to the lengthy period of time that would be necessary for that. And it'll impede the ability to do a commercial transaction in the speed with which it has to be done. So I think you break it up and look at it in two different pieces.
So let me draw that out a little bit, because we've, I guess, received some comments or questions concerning whether at the time of an application for an exemption that the firm submitting the application is good to go until told otherwise, and whether that's a good process, and why would that be a good process?
I think for the individual transaction it should be. I think maybe we'll look to Tom a little bit, but when you're dealing with the exchange again, what you do is you apply in advance for a hedge exemption. They tell you the sort of scope of what you can do. If you have an individual transaction that you need to do, you can do that within that umbrella. With the structure that is being set up for federal spec limits, you don't apply in advance necessarily, and then you just notify afterwards. And that flip of the process is what's creating this problem for you, I think. And so I think if we revert back again to an exchange process where perhaps you've either told the exchange in advance in your initial application, or you go to the exchange with the specific transaction, you'd be in a position where it got a level of review in a timely fashion, and the commercial firm was able to do the transaction they were looking to do.
He's drawing you out, Tom.
So he is. Vince, I do think that the exchange would have an appetite. I know that Tim also has some thoughts on this. I'm not going to speak for him, but I think the exchanges would be open to a 147-like process, whether you want to say we're doing it on behalf of the commission or doing the initial review from the participant by the DCM, passing those results on to the commission. I think there's an appetite there where we can be an effective tool in assisting this process. I think there are some certain conditions or stipulations we'd need to make in that. I'd say that we are acting in good faith in reviewing the facts and circumstances, the appropriateness, as you would.
But would you be making that information publicly available? It was sort of, masking in some respects, I guess, the nature of the request, but giving information out to market participants so that they otherwise can rely on the exemption that's been provided.
In what I'm contemplating here, I hadn't. However, I think that there could or should be some type of a means by which, if you see DCMs coming to the CFTC with repeat comparable examples, that may be the stimulus for the agency to maybe even possibly look at those types of what you might call currently non-enumerateds. Maybe they should be in fact enumerated. So I think, again, a process could yield light to that. But I do think we need some type of an understanding that in conducting that activity, we're doing so in good faith. We render those decisions that the agency, if you decide otherwise in hindsight that you don't agree, that we haven't somehow violated any kind of a core principle. And I think we also probably need to consider some type of a structure where we're not drawing disparate conclusions, such that I think example X seems to work by my review or my team's review of the activity, and another DCM's review is to the contrary. I think we'd have to contemplate how we would do it.
It seems as if what you're suggesting is maybe an additional process. I mean, there was 1.47, there was exchange processes, there was the proposal which did not continue 1.47. It seems like you're talking about a third, fourth alternative, which was in a sense, perhaps a joint effort between the DCMs and the commission that you're envisioning. And I'd just like to have you kind of explain maybe a little further as to how you think this might work in terms of, it sounds like you thought each exchange could you said the initial review, then it would come over to the commission. What is it that you would say is the most productive, most timely, productive, and efficient and way to carry this out? Because we'd like to hear, we've gotten all kinds of comments, as was mentioned. We'd like to hear from your perspective, and I'd like to hear actually from both of your perspective, both exchanges, what it is you view as the preferred way that we should look at this. Because, we've heard some of the, from some of those who use these things, they want just the most timely, the simplest way is obviously the best for them. What is it from your perspective?
Riva, again, frankly, the questions that were posed to the panel are what provoked the thought as to, you asked for other alternatives. And so I did certainly give some thought to what those alternatives could be. and there was an eye towards an expeditious handling on the part of the participant applying. Some, let's call it 30-day window, some structure where the information comes to the exchange. We've got a set amount of time to respond. If we have questions, we've got the ability to go back. We have then the ability to do one of probably maybe three things: grant it, deny it, or if the party doesn't seem to be satisfying us, and we're saying we don't see this right now, they could potentially withdraw it. Let's say, for example, we pass on it positively. We advise the agency, send the file over. You've got an ability there to review it. Again, that seemed like an expeditious means by, in attempting to process these. I do think that you'd have to have some kind of a process on your side where you're looking at the totality of these documents that are coming at you, and to the extent that they're consistent, maybe you want to have a process where you consider moving them into a more, enumerated type classification. If you see a conflict, I think that's probably a bad outcome, and that should be brought to the attention of the DCMs. Or if you see it, again, somehow intercepted. Again, Tim and I haven't talked about it in length. Maybe there could be a process of information sharing during the initial process so that we can collectively see that we're on the same page. So I can't say to you that I've thought from front to back every possible step, but it was simply an attempt to come up with an alternative that I think that the industry was looking for, because their concern was expeditious answer.
Tim?
Yeah, I would agree. And this is, I think, one of the happy circumstances where each of the two exchanges looked at the documents in front of us and came to the same conclusion. You almost suggested that in your question, number 3, are there alternatives to the procedure such as exchange review and approval that would support a pre-approval reliance? I think the light bulb went off on both exchanges at the same time. That absolutely, that would be an expeditious, appropriate process with the protections that Tom mentioned for the presumption of good faith actions on the part of the exchange and that the commercial entity who's gone ahead and relied upon the initial favorable ruling from the exchange. We hadn't talked in any depth about trying to find a mechanism to ensure that there would be consistent treatment across the different DCMs of similar circumstances. That clearly is something that we probably should think about. Obviously, anything that would be done subject to CFTC final approval and review, and that would help provide a forum for ensuring that the two exchanges don't have disparate outcomes in similar circumstances. But it does seem to be a reasonable route to try to address the concerns of the commercials that this new process at the CFTC alone might take too long while still meeting your objectives. And
so the question there in terms of what is expeditious versus what is time constrained. So if there's some marker that's 10 days and yet you're hearing some of these strategies are very complex, that you have the ability at an exchange or at the commission level, frankly, to consider the nuances in order to consider the application, including a more broad application, not just for the submitter. So I think that's some of the items that we're trying to get at, and the management of resources, of course, by the agency as well as the exchanges shouldn't be diminished.
Yeah, Vince, one additional point. I don't mean to be a killjoy here, but I do think that we would probably have to think a bit about maybe certain restrictions with pre-assuming positions, depending on the market. For example, energy's got a 3-day spot period. If something is complete, this is an unenumerated application, to assume that position with only 3 days to liquidate, if we didn't agree, there's liquidation circumstances that could come up. So I'm just simply saying I would have to give some further thought to that, and I mentioned it to Tim. And not all markets, we know, they're not all the same. Some of them have got a lengthier delivery period. Maybe in some it would be appropriate that you could look at this in a spot month circumstance. I might be a little bit more reserved in other markets that have got a very, very compressed spot month period and want to get that application in advance.
Great. So I'm a little mindful of time, but I know John's been patient, so.
Vincent, can I jump in real quick?
Of course.
Both of you mentioned the desire to have some sort of presumption of good faith on the part of the exchange if you're reviewing these requests. But what do you have in mind? Do you have in mind basically an understanding between the staff and the DCMs, or do you have something more specific in mind? I'm just kind of curious what exactly. I mean, we always presume you're all acting in good faith. In other words, I mean.
Commissioner Weegin, I think that what we were both just simply thinking is, yes, we're acting in good faith. If for some reason the staff, ultimately in review concluded otherwise, I think our comment between us is we'd hate to see a core principle action, coming against, either of the designated contract markets. I'd like to think that wouldn't happen, but that's just simply the concern. We certainly act in good faith, and it would be our intention to do so.
Yeah, precisely. If we're going to set this up under commission regs as an appropriate process, we don't want to find ourselves subject to adverse actions at the end of it if we've acted in good faith.
John?
So there are lots of ways of structuring something like this, and most of which to pay attention to all of the different considerations, most of which are beyond me. I only have two simple points. One is, I think it's very important for the commission to have internal to the commission the capacity, and that capacity is only going to be there if it's regularly exercised. So if there's deference given to other institutions for large volumes of these things or speed or what have you, whatever, but there should be a certain amount of de novo analysis and review going on within the commission on this kind of thing. I also think as far as public comment period, it's important for things that are happening in large volume to somehow periodically come to the fore from the public. I think it would be very good if we had some sort of statistics, for example, of the scale of bona fide hedging exemptions and of different types, including those that are being granted that are non-enumerated, and that would give a greater capacity for others to sort of say, hey, wait a second, it's time to check into that one, and let's find out what's inside that category.
Great, thank you. More mindful of time. I think unless there are any further comments on this particular panel, we'll close out this session this morning. My thanks to all of your feedback. We'll consider all the comments, of course, going forward. We're going to take a break for lunch, and we'll start back up at 1 o'clock. Thanks again.